how's everybody doing? Thank you so much for coming. It is a beautiful day. I know we're all itching to go out in our gardens and start pruning things and all that, but thank you so much for coming by today. Show of hands, how many of you have been to a CapSci event before? So lots of newcomers today, so this is really great. I'm so delighted to have you here. So my name is Sarah Burke. I'm a professor at Siena College. I'm also the founding president of CapSci, although our current president is Dr. Cara, professor of anthropology at Albany. She will be our moderator today. And I just briefly want to tell you a little bit about CapSci. We were born in the March for Science. The March for Science 2017 is how we all met, and out of that we decided to form an organization. Our mission is to bring scientists and people who aren't scientists together and to promote science in the public interest. We do many, many kinds of events. Most often we do Science on Tap, which is a monthly lecture series. I say lecture, it's much more fun than lectures. But we bring scientists to bars. We rotate through Albany, Schenectady, and Troy. They tell us about your research, about their research over beer and food. And the next one will be on April 30th at Albany Pump Station, and that'll be about digital security, especially protecting photographs in the digital age. Without further ado, I just want to say a couple things. We are, of course, totally dependent on donations for all of our activities, and there are several ways you can get involved. If you wanted to make a donation of $10 or higher today, we have some thank you gifts that we would give you. We've got a cool Science on Tap magnet. It says, "You have questions, we have beer." We also have an I Heart Science bumper sticker with an anatomical heart for the science geeks out there. And if you wanted to become a member of CapSci for a $25 membership, you could be a card-carrying member that says, this card says, "I am a force for science," and we can help you with all of that at the back table there afterwards. And without any further ado, I will turn the event over to Cara and our really exciting group of panelists so that we can start talking about science advocacy. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And I'd also like to give a huge thank you to the Sanctuary for Independent Media for hosting us today and setting us up with this great venue. We're really excited about it. So the way I think this panel will run, the way we kind of want it to run is I'm going to introduce our panelists, and I have a series of questions for them. And that might take about 45 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, and then we'd like to open up questions to the audience. And we'll have a microphone here so that you can actually come up and be heard by everybody in this venue today. So that's kind of the general plan. And I'd like to introduce you to what is going to be a really fascinating and wonderful group of panelists, and also a big round of applause for the organizers of this event. We've got Jessica Riker back there, Natalie, and Liz Fisher. They found all of these amazing panelists and they put all of the organization into it, so they were really the heavy lifters here. So thank you three so much for all the work that you did. We appreciate it. All right, so I'm going to start with the one closest to me, Dr. Abby, and then I'm going to move down the line. So Dr. Abby Kinchy is an associate professor of science and technology studies at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. And then we have next to her Katy Dunn, who is from the district office for the Congressional Aide for Paul Tonko. And then we have Bobbi Wilding, who is the Deputy Director of Clean and Healthy New York. Then we have Dr. Emilly Obuya, who is an Assistant Professor of Chemistry and Biochemistry at the Sage Colleges. And then last but not least, we have Meghan Marohn, who wears so many hats. She's going to get quite a bit of an introduction here, so prepare yourself. She is a high school English teacher as well as an adjunct English professor. She is also on the committee for Green Sanctuary of the Albany Unitarians, and she's also a part of Extinction Rebellion. So we have a lot of different and interesting perspectives today on this panel to talk about the state of science in this country today. And I think the first one is going to be easiest, and again, I think we'll start with Abby and kind of move down the line. So I gave just a brief what your name is and what your title is, but if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit more about what you do, and maybe why you're here and why you agreed to be a part of this panel.
Sure, great. Thanks so much for the introduction, and thanks everybody for being here on this beautiful day. So I'm a sociologist, so I'm a social scientist, but I'm also a sociologist who studies science, so I'm involved in this in multiple sort of layered ways. So I teach at RPI, and I teach in a program called Science and Technology Studies, and I teach classes for two different majors. One is called Sustainability Studies, And it's for students who are really passionate about the environment and making this a planet that we can all survive on and thrive on. And I teach in a major called Science, Technology, and Society, which is about asking questions about science and technology and its political, social, and cultural implications. And I also do research. So my research focuses on the role of science in political decision-making and activism. So I look at social movements around controversial technologies like fracking. That's what a lot of my research has been on recently, but also around genetically engineered foods. And most recently, I'm looking at some issues around climate politics and responding to new, more frequent flooding in rural areas. So I study how communities use science in their efforts to mobilize for social change, and how science then fits into policy processes and decision making, sometimes in ways that don't help people, and sometimes in ways that it does. So those are some of the perspectives that I'm going to be bringing to this panel today.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Katy Dunn. I'm with Congressman Tonko's office. I serve as his field representative. And so what I do is very much so twofold. When he's in district, on nights and weekends, I go around to all of his events with him, make sure that he's properly briefed and staffed, make sure that we're staying on schedule. And then when he is in DC or he has a scheduling conflict, I attend events on his behalf. I meet with groups and constituents, and I also do outreach through our Albany office as well. My background is in political science, and prior to my current position, I mainly worked on various local and state and federal campaigns. The congressman is in his 6th term in Congress. He's one of the few engineers on the Hill. He's actually an industrial and mechanical engineer by trade. He serves on the Energy and Commerce Committee, Science, Space, and Technology Committee, and also the Natural Resources Committee. And he serves, as of this legislative session, as the chairman of the Subcommittee on Environment and Climate Change.
I'm Bobbi Wilding. I'm the Deputy Director of Clean and Healthy New York. We're an almost 13-year-old environmental health advocacy organization focused on getting toxic chemicals out of everyday life. So our primary focus has been working on identifying chemicals of concern in products made for children, and using the science that we have from a whole host of folks across the country and around the world to understand how chemicals used in everyday products are contributing to health problems and how we can avoid them. I have an environmental science background, degree from RPI, and I didn't necessarily think that I was going to be an advocate when I went through school. And so I found myself, though, very quickly working in the advocacy world, and never left, because I really enjoyed taking the scientific information that's out there and applying it and bringing it to making change in the world. So when it was given the opportunity to come and talk about science and advocacy, I was, this is a perfect fit for what I've done for the last 20 years.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Emilio Bria, and I'm currently an Associate Professor of Chemistry at Russell Sage College. Naturally, I'm from Kenya. I come from Kenya, and I've been in the United States for maybe 10 to 11 years. My training, my research focus has been on developing nanotechnological solutions for environmental remediation, so removing toxic chemicals from the environment, particularly water bodies. So if you ever seen a river that looks red or blue, or it's heavily contaminated with dyes or organic pollutants or bacteria, so my research focuses on developing nanotechnological solutions to clean that up. Recently, this past year, I've been involved in developing a very simple water decontamination technique that's called SODIS. That's solar disinfection. So this is particularly a method that's is applicable to communities that don't have access to centralized water treatment or distribution systems, particularly countries in third world countries, especially from where I'm from in Kenya. There are some communities, especially in the rural areas, that don't have access to water clean water for drinking. And so kids would just drink whatever water they find in the, in the neighborhood, and most of the time the water is heavily contaminated with bacteria. So my students and I, this past year, we got a grant from the EPA, and we were working on developing the SODIS as a method for cleaning up that water. And simply all we did was take contaminated water and put it in a bottle like this one, and then just leave it out in the sun for a couple of hours, and the UV rays in the sun manages to decontaminate that water. Now this method, while it was really focused on that particular community that does not have access to water treatment methods, it could be for anyone. Let's say in an emergency situation where we have a flooding occurring, like in Puerto Rico a few years ago. They did not have access to water because water was contaminated. So right now we are looking at developing that method, not just for specific areas, but really for anyone. Anytime you would have access to water that's not clean, then you'd be able to use that method to clean up your water. Other than that, I'm also involved in the Sanctuary for Media Alliance. I recently just joined this group. I think they do amazing work. We're going to be part of the board that is involved in developing programming for the Nature Lab. And so if you're here for the first time, I invite you to come back as soon as we have some great programming going on. Tuesdays, we have kids coming in from local middle schools, and we do programming with them just to make the science programming available for all. Thank you.
Excuse me, my name is Meghan Marohn, and I'm very honored to be on this panel with all of you. And it's kind of a dream come true, because even though I'm an English teacher, I've always loved science and had a deep love of Carl Sagan and cosmos, and really loved Carl Sagan. So always kind of felt like I wanted to be involved with physics or be in the sciences, but felt like my kind of main path was in English education. So for the past 13 years, I've been a high school English teacher and adjunct professor, which was already part of my intro. And the National Council of Teachers of English has just put out a statement saying that it's actually expected professionally that English teachers address climate change, which is really cool and really freeing for all of us who are already within the high school English teaching profession. It's very, very freeing, because then we can tailor our curriculum for both reading and writing and literacy to be centered on this issue, which I kind of don't know how reading and writing about life in the year 2019 couldn't be centered around that issue. So, excuse me, getting over a cold. The capacity I'm speaking in the capacity of also speaking about Extinction Rebellion. And in the fall of this past year, the Swedish teenage activist Greta Thunberg made a lot of waves, both with her protesting, skipping school, and speaking in places like Davos, and using really rhetorically powerful phrases within her speeches to pretty powerful world leaders, like saying the house is on fire and we need to be actively and directly addressing climate change. And so at that moment, some friends from Troy went down and researched Extinction Rebellion at an organizing meeting in New York. And this was after, in November of 2018, this movement started in Great Britain and became so well organized that they shut down the 5 major bridges into London. So at that point, some friends from Troy went down to New York City, researched Extinction Rebellion, wanted to see if the demands and the precepts of the movement were things that lined up with what we believe, which is that the climate crisis is a manifestation of a lot of other social and economic problems that have been developing for a really long time. And so there is definitely an intersectional approach to Extinction Rebellion. They felt like the movement was becoming really well organized in New York City. Then we went down, excuse me, we went down in January 26th, and there was a big action in New York City on January 26th, in which people skated onto the ice at Rockefeller Center, and someone hung a banner on Prometheus that said, "Climate change equals mass murder." And we marched down Fifth Avenue in a nonviolent direct action movement. So now we're trying to organize even more. There was an Extinction Rebellion meeting at Oakwood Community Center, and we're encouraging people from all walks of life to become involved in Extinction Rebellion and to join in nonviolent direct action, because the 30 years, 40 years of trying to change policy through the normal methods of, just advocacy don't seem to be working. And Extinction Rebellion is demanding that we go to renewables by 2025, which seems crazy to think that Western civilization or civilization in general would move to renewables in 6 years, but it feels like the alternative is also insane. So we're just trying to encourage everyone to join in nonviolent direct action. I'll talk more about it after other people speak.
All right, thank you so much. So for the next question, I think I actually want to start with Bobbi, if you're okay with that, because you said in your introduction that you didn't see yourself necessarily becoming a science advocate and activist. And so, and anyone can feel free to jump in as well, why are you passionate about science activism and advocacy?
Well, so for me, I started my summer jobs as a canvasser for a variety of public interest research groups, both in Michigan and here in New York. And then I got hired by an organization called Citizens Environmental Coalition. And so that was after I got my environmental science degree, and I always planned to go back and get a master's degree. But I found myself really enjoying talking with the public about what was happening in our community. We were focused on cleaning up toxic waste sites at that organization. And so I was in graduate school working on a ecological economics, values, and policy master's degree. And I was writing papers that I was giving to professors about my thoughts. And at the same time, I was still working, and I was preparing a guide to hospital waste managers on how they could avoid using harmful chemicals and how they could avoid, incinerating their waste, et cetera. And I realized that I really had a passion for making a difference in the world, and I felt like that was how I could make a bigger impact if I'm sending out this report to 90 hospitals and then engaging them to make a difference. It really sparked something in me that made me want to rededicate myself to that kind of science translation. And I think that it's interesting because in the work that I've done, we hear a lot from people talking about how we need to talk to people about their values, and we need to talk about, sort of get people in their guts. And I think that there's also a real need to be talking to people about what we know, what there is evidence for and how we can act on that. And those two things line up. But I really feel like there's a lot of information embedded in scientific journals, and it has impacts on people's daily lives. And whether it's about bisphenol A in a baby bottle, or it's about climate change, making sure that people understand what the stakes are and what we actually know about the world is really important. And one of the challenges that I face is that there are sort of different definitions of good science. And one of the arenas in which good science is being defined is by the industry. It's not by the scientists, it's not by academics. And I think that they have been very successful at muddying the waters so that one can't tell the difference between independent academic research that has meaning to our lives and the kind of ways that they define what scientific research is valid. We go up against the American Chemistry Council every day. They are our biggest opposition. I feel like we really need those independent science voices and to be bringing that out to the public in order to make a real difference. And we need advocacy to be able to counter frankly, immense amounts of money that the American Chemistry Council pours into lobbying and putting out so-called science that muddies the waters of what the truth is about chemicals we're concerned about.
Anyone else want to jump in? Yep.
I'll jump in. I feel like, yeah, with just going off of what you said, the Extinction Rebellion movement is based on people. I mean, if there is a head, it's a group of people who started it who are scientists in Great Britain. But ultimately, like a lot of leftist movements, there's this idea that it could be, excuse me, non-hierarchical, that different people could meet in little groups, and that movements need to happen everywhere. But it came about based on the IPCC report. So just kind of validating what you're saying, this whole idea that there needs to be action based on real scientific data, but how we're also, the acknowledgement that we're living in a world in which that very data has been purposefully covered up and purposefully, even more than covered up, which has, connotations of like real kind of like direct, hiding of information, which does happen, but also, like you said, muddying the waters of what you know and what you can get access to. And there's almost this purposeful confusion over things. And so the idea with a populist uprising or some sort of direct action movement is that if you are living in that sort of world and the corporate interests are lining the pockets of our legislators so heavily that then policy is coming about because of those corporate interests and not because of the science, that you need people to take direct action immediately.
Anyone else? That means the easy intro questions are done, and we're now going to get down to some business. And I think Meghan's answer kind of leads well into it. So how would you describe the state of science in the 2 years since the Trump administration took office? And maybe elaborate a little on why you think we're seeing the changes we are seeing. Go for it.
So one of my biggest concerns is that the staff at federal agencies like the EPA, but many other agencies as well, have been either fired or have left the agencies, or their work has been censored. The United States has a really huge scientific workforce at federal agencies, but they have been really stifled under the Trump administration, and this is a serious problem for our ability to regulate industries, but also to do a lot of basic science that informs policy and informs regulation. But I do want to point out that this also happened under the Reagan administration. It also happened under the George W. Bush administration. This is not the first time that this has happened, and we need to understand that this is part of a longer history of a conservative movement in the United States. And so it's an even bigger problem, right? So this is not just a 2-year blip, right? This is an ongoing right-wing attempt to stifle and censor science that is potentially critical of certain industries that are polluting or maybe harmful to health. And that is something we need to look really carefully and critically at. And so I think that it's really important that when we have these moments like we have right now, where we are rightfully very alarmed about what's going on under the Trump administration. But I think we should also not lose sight of the fact that this is a much longer struggle, a much longer set of problems, and that it's not gonna go away just by getting rid of Trump, for example. That we have to actually think about what is actually driving this problem. This is a decades-long situation where scientists who are doing extremely important research in the public interest have been, go through these waves of being pushed out or silenced when they work in public agencies. I mean, I remember when I was in graduate school, in the early 2000s under the George W. Bush administration, and we were all just so alarmed and incensed about some things that were happening because of what was called at the time the Republican war on science. And I remember my advisor and I at the time wrote this impassioned article in the left-wing journal Dissent about how should we think about these attacks on science, and how can we think about them in a way that sets us on a path for the future of more critical thought about the role of science in policymaking. And we felt really good about we've figured it out. We figured out the way to think about this. And here we are all these years later, and we're like, well, we have to unearth that article again because we're going through this all again. And that's just to say that these are problems that are not just blips. It's not just a political moment. It is a long-term struggle that we need to be engaged in. And so I think it's exciting that we have the March for Science. We have these these strengthened organizing efforts. And I think we have to recognize that this is going to be a long-term social movement.
Can I ask you a follow-up question on that? I told you I'd do this to you.
Yeah, do it.
So I think it's actually very important what you said, that this has been a decades-long attack on science. So what do you think is different now that's brought about that March for Science response, where you see this mobilized activist movement that we didn't necessarily see before? And anyone can jump on this, so I don't have to put her on the spot.
I don't know. I wonder if it was just the energy of its social movement spillover. Right? So there was so much social movement organizing with the election of Trump. And there's something about, there is this thing that happens when there are large social movements happening at once. So one march organizes, another march organizes. People begin to get active, and that becomes sort of contagious. And so, the first March for Science, in a way, seemed to sort of build on the energy of the resistance that was mobilizing at the same time. And so I almost wonder if it was just because of the
polarization of it all?
Or just the strength of organizing that was really happening all at once. We do tend to have, social movements sort of happen in these clusters. And that's a good thing, right? We build on the strength of each other. And that, although, that doesn't really explain why, when we were organizing against the Iraq War in the George W. Bush administration, there wasn't a March for Science. So I don't know. It's interesting. Now I have to puzzle over it.
I've had an answer to that, I think.
Yeah.
Just to build on that, I think the other thing that we're seeing, in addition to the silencing of career scientists, is the appointment of people at the highest level of decision-making who represent interests that are counter to the public interest. And it's interesting, certainly all of the companies that support the American Chemistry Council, which is obviously, that's my lane, they all use science to develop their products, right? But they only use certain parts of science, and they want to ignore the parts of the evidence of what we know about their products when it's inconvenient. And I think that it's less profitable for them if we're paying attention to the full picture. And so when you have someone who came in as clearly a corporate crony as Trump is, who clearly has borne out our concerns in terms of who's been appointed at all of these high positions. People who literally worked for the American Chemistry Council before his administration came in are now making decisions about the chemicals that we're supposedly regulating. I really feel like that is a motivating factor, because we could see it coming. That I think that scientists and people who are concerned about actually having knowledge about our world in a way that is unbiased as we can make it, of course, saw that this was not what that administration had in mind, and clearly it's not what they're putting into practice.
I think I have a comment on that too. Within the past few years, it's been grim, I can say, in terms of the idea that as scientists we are supposed to predict or notice observations and work on models and then do some research to provide data that will inform the government or will inform engineers or will inform the public to like take charge of the situation to generate change. I think with the Trump administration cutting funding in most of these government institutions, federal institutions that provide funding, it creates an unrest because then most of the data that is produced, that is actually data that's very authentic, that could be about climate change and what's going to be happening in the next 10 or 12 years, if that's not acted upon, then the public knows, and the public is scientifically literate, and we know what's going to happen. We know that climate change is coming. It's not that something that is just manufactured. We know what the data says, and we know that within the next 10, actually it's 10, 12 years, the global warming thing, it's gonna be worse. We're gonna see sea levels rising. We're gonna see certain things happening. And if the job of our government is to act upon that and to make sure that we are going to set up structures to mitigate that risk. What should we be doing as a population to ensure that when climate change comes, that we're able to protect ourselves, to protect our families, and to be able to just stay safe? A lot of countries around the world are already taking measures. We should be the ones who are at the forefront of doing this. And if that's not happening, then people begin to be people begin to uprise. The March for Science is just a statement from the public which states that the government should do something about this. And if it's not doing this, if we're going to be engaging in debate that's not progressing the cause, then it's just always going to be an uprise.
So Katy, as our representative from Tonko's office, you're kind of our government insider. Yeah. So I was wondering your take on this question.
Yeah, of course. So from our perspective in the House of Representatives, in the last 2 years, it's been really discouraging to see what's been happening to the state of science from the Trump administration. So after this past midterm, it's been amazing to be in the majority in the House of Representatives because we can't rely on the executive to move forward and progress with science. So we've had to take it upon ourselves. We held the first hearing in the subcommittee on environment and climate change on climate change in 6 years, which is, just considering the level of this crisis, is just outstanding that it's taken 6 years of being in the minority to have that come to fruition again. And in his position, he's released his principles on climate change and how we should address it in US Congress. And going forward, these are the principles that all legislation that comes through his committee on how to address climate change need to be compared against. I've brought copies of those for anyone who is interested, so please feel free to come up to me after, but I'll just read these principles to you as well. So the first principle, which is incredibly important, is we need to adopt science-based targets for greenhouse gas neutrality by mid-century. A clean US economy should be strong, competitive, and fair. Climate action should invest in America's future. Climate action should deliver a just and equitable transition. Climate action should protect low-income households. Climate action should strengthen community resilience to better withstand new climate realities. Climate action should empower state, local, tribal, and territorial governments. And climate action should avoid harm to first movers. And climate action should create stable and predictable policies going forward.
Thank you for that. I kind of want to keep the conversation going a little bit about the activism that we've been seeing. So Meghan, you talked about a march that you did in New York, and we've seen the March for Science. We've seen protests once the US pulled out of the Paris Accord, and we've even seen some targeted action like students coming together and suing the federal government over climate change. And so I was wondering everyone's take on which of these actions, all or maybe none, are actually impactful, and maybe what are some things that we should be putting our energy towards when it comes to activism? What's actually going to be useful to bring about meaningful change?
Okay, so I can speak to that. It's definitely all very important. All of these things in tandem with one another really creates a statement. Another incredibly important aspect of this is not just mobilizing, but also voting. As we saw, I mean, it's not all going to change just by voting and getting Democrats into office, but we really do need to make that stand. And as we've seen with the midterm elections, so much more has been done since the first 2 years of Trump's administration. So that's why the first legislative piece from the House of Representatives was H.R. 1, the For the People Act, which really strengthens voting rights, making sure that people get out, that it's easier to access these things, and that we're getting big money out of politics as well. It makes sure that people in office can't be on for-profit boards, so they can't be advocating for special interests. And it's just really important that we make our electoral process safer and easier to access for all of our citizens.
Can I ask you maybe it's a silly question. When people write in to Tonko's office and call, how seriously are those letters taken? So how important are actual, letters from constituents and phone calls from constituents? Who reads those?
Oh, it's incredibly important. So how our office works is we have 3 district offices up here in New York 20, and we also have a DC office where our policy team exists. And so when you call into any of our offices, you write in, you have an interaction with us, you stop by the office, we catalog that. We put that into our system, and we make sure that you get a response from our office that is detailed. If it needs to come from our policy team, if it's specific on our positions, we will get that to you, but it is incredibly important, and it's really something that the congressman has staked his reputation on being really in touch with his constituency.
I can jump into that as well. I think any type of advocacy is important, and some will be important at different times. For instance, we live in a generation where we wait for a crisis before anyone can speak up against anything. We always wait for an emergency situation. For instance, in the case of climate change, we're probably waiting to see all the rivers flooding, and we're probably waiting to see a drought situation before we can take action. So I think the best type of advocacy is one where we engage in collaboration. We work with the government, we work with different sectors, the advocacy groups, so that we ensure that together as a group of people, we're all working towards the same thing, and we're all aware of what each other are doing. Particularly the public. The public needs to be aware of what some of the things that we can do as a public to ensure that, what gets to our congressmen or what gets to our, to our government leaders. And I'm really excited, Meghan, that you actually have climate change in your curriculum, because I believe our education system needs to put these really public concerns in our curriculum. Our kids need to know about it. We need to have students in classrooms aware of what the risks are, whether it's climate change, whether it's public health. And then we also need to teach our kids how to advocate for themselves. So is it writing a letter? How do you write a letter? If it's speaking up or speaking to someone in government, how do you initiate that conversation? How do you find your voice? So I believe advocacy just depends on what situation we're in, but advocacy needs to be there, and it needs to start from the schools to the public to professionals, and it just needs to be a constant thing that's always on the table.
Can I jump in? Oh, were you going to go? Go ahead, Meghan.
Go for it, Bobbi.
So the kind of work that Clean and Healthy New York does is primarily we do advocacy at the Capitol, where we're working to change laws here in New York, and we also work to change what companies are doing in terms of their own internal policies. And those are really important, but we also do organize protests and marches when we need to, because that's an important way to demonstrate collective power. I believe that we need the public to be as active as possible, like turning the volume up, frankly. And so all of those modes, I think, are really important. I also think that it's important for scientists to be a little bold. In my experience, scientists are taught to ask what's the next question we should be answering. You're always, of course you're never done, right? We could learn something groundbreaking that totally changes what we understand today. But acting on our best information today and having scientists talk about what they do understand as strongly as they can and as simply as they can, I think really helps decision makers. And it really helps even the public know what to unmuddy the water. Because I feel like when you come to the conclusions of papers, it's all about what do we need to study next. And I think that's appropriate for that kind of journal. But public communication to empower people so that they can take that information that you have, the knowledge that you've gained through the research you've done, and make it accessible so that people can pick it up and use it is really, really important. And also communicating directly with decision makers. I think that, that is something that we could benefit a lot from, is having people with scientific expertise be willing to speak further from their position of knowledge. That would make a big difference in these things. But at the end of the day, I think that we are up against money. That's why think it's so important where you started from, Katy, that it's not just about whether or not you can vote and having money in politics, although that's key. There's big money being poured into our decision-making processes at every level. And the thing that I see in other countries that we don't have here in the US is willingness to shut things down, right? We're not shutting down, we're not walking out on strikes, we're not, and I think that that's something that makes us more vulnerable as a people to these economic powers, because that's the power we have, is the power of our feet. And, I don't know exactly. If I could figure that out, you'd see me leading that march. So I hope that I figure it out, but hopefully someone else out here will be inspired to figure out how to get people to walk, because I think it's gonna need to require something like that. That is how people use their power in other countries really effectively.
Going off what all of you just said, I'm thinking about a number of things. A friend of mine who is a psychotherapist told me that she just read a study that for young people in schools, their two greatest anxieties are school shootings and climate change. And a lot of young people are walking around with those fears, and they're real. I mean, we live in a world in which obviously high schools have lockdown drills. Sometimes those drills, we don't know purposefully whether there's something real going on or not. But what's kind of cool is that we also have models now of young people domestically and around the world who have stood up. So I just think that in terms of young people, we all have to bear the mantle of being educators, and using Emma Gonzalez's speech in the classroom and being like, right here, this is somebody who wrote this speech, went out, all of those kids who formed movements, and all of those kids who also exercised their right. They had every right to walk out, to use their feet, to walk out of the school. That's huge, the Earth Guardians kids, and the whole idea of suing the federal government, or the kids in Albany who organized the Youth Climate March a couple of weeks ago, and there's another one coming up in May, and adults can come, and adults can also stand in the back and not take over. I mean, nobody did, but just emphasizing that, just kind of being this buffer of support. And I think the more that we do that, the better, because it's validating the kids' intuition. I don't think the kids always feel completely comfortable talking about what they're very afraid of, but the more that we validate that and say, right, and we're not seeing it now, but this country does have a history of people who put their lives on the line for different issues. And the demands always seemed impossible with things like the civil rights movement, for example. So the more that you can emphasize that, obviously I'm thinking in my mind as an English teacher of, trying to use Greta Thunberg's speech for rhetorical analysis. but how for all of us, just trying to get young people involved in those ways is really, really important.
So Bobbi, you brought up something that I kind of want to steer the conversation towards, and that's the role of science communication. And this is not just a question for Bobbi, everybody, but you brought it up. And specifically, how science and scientists should be informing policy, and perhaps how scientists can be bold, as you say, and more proactive about giving our input. And then perhaps, Katy, you might touch on how willing representatives, I know you don't speak for all representatives, how willing they are to listen to the scientists' input and use that to inform legislation.
So Congressman Tonko, being one of the few engineers on the Hill, is incredibly devoted to hearing what scientists have to say. He always says we need to do things in a science-based, evidence-based manner. And in his time, in his chairmanship, he has brought in numerous scientists to testify in front of Congress, bring their findings, specifically on climate change, so that way we can hear their perspective, because they're the experts and they're the ones that have studied this, and for far too long we have not been hearing that perspective.
Is there anything you would say to a scientist, like write to your congressman and offer up a meeting? And what kind of specific things can be done?
Yeah, so I know for our office in particular, we always, we meet with groups, we meet with individuals who have specific concerns. We're also out and about in the community a lot, so we do hear from people through that way. The congressman is constantly out at events. The past few weekends, we went to getting back a little bit to involving the youth. We went to a first robotics competition at RPI. We went to a sea perch competition at RPI. And then we're also meeting, the people that are educating the students at these events and mentoring them, as well as professors and professionals. So we really do make an effort to hear the appropriate perspective that should be speaking on these issues.
A couple comments that I want to make. I want to echo something that Bobbi said before about scientists needing to be bolder. I think that, so there's this just a pretty widespread belief, and I think it's part of the culture of science, of thinking that science and advocacy need to be separate from each other because advocacy and politics somehow contaminates your ability to do good science, right? That it somehow makes you less objective, or makes your science contaminated, or you're not impartial enough. And that's something that as a scientist you have to navigate every day, because you're constantly sort of beating back accusations that maybe your research is biased, or you're always facing credibility attacks. That's just part of being a scientist. But I think that what we really need right now are scientists who are good scientists, committed to representing the world in accurate ways, right? Finding the answers to really important questions, and are also willing to stand up and advocate for the environment, for public issues that they care about. Right? And so I think that scientists need the help of the public in challenging that widespread cultural perception that scientists can't do that, right? That scientists shouldn't be allowed to do that. Because I think it is widely thought that, scientists shouldn't have a point of view on something. And as soon as you have a point of view on something, you're not credible, right? You're not really a legitimate scientist. Your claims couldn't really be believable because you clearly are, it's skewed toward a particular point of view. That's really problematic. It's holding scientists back from being the important advocates that they need to be if we're going to make good policy. So how do we fix this? I don't know. It's super complex, but I do think we need a change in how we think about science in policy and science in public. And I would love for the public to come along with this change in some way, and to question that sort of knee-jerk reaction that, oh, that scientist is also an activist, oh, they must be biased. Like, question that when somebody says that. Question that when you hear that in the media, right? You think about, well, what actually makes this research good research, rather than assuming that a scientist who's also an activist lacks credibility. So that's my first thing that I want to put out there. And then the second thing is this question about the role of scientists informing policy. I mean, I think that many different kinds of knowledge need to inform policy. And this is, you know, oftentimes we actually see delays in forming good policy because politicians who support, for example, polluting industries will say, well, there isn't enough science on this yet. We can't make regulations on it, or we can't make a policy saying, we can't even make policy on climate change, or we can't make a policy on pesticides, or whatever, because there isn't enough science done on it yet. And so in that way, sometimes the call to have like sound science-based policy can actually slow down the creation of good policy. And so in those cases, I think it's valuable to have other kinds of knowledge, like the experiences of sick people who live near oil refineries, right? Who should inform policy about regulating oil refineries. Even if the science about air pollution coming off oil refineries is still not super done, right? And there's still more questions to ask, and it's hard to make the connections between exposure to air pollution off of oil refineries and experiences of ill health, right? Sometimes we need to make policy even when the science isn't done. And so I think that, you know, I completely support the idea that we need scientists who have finished their research informing policy, but I also support the idea that sometimes when we haven't finished the research, we still need to make policy. And so we need to be open to thinking about other kinds of knowledge informing policy, particularly when opponents of policy, because they're supporters of polluting industries, are saying, oh wait, slow down, we gotta wait till the science is done, because that's a ploy that we see a lot.
Yeah. As a scientist, I think with science communication, science is very different when it's inside a lab. It's also very different when it comes to a public forum like this one, because the way I look at my chemicals and molecules and design them, I would have to translate that to a public audience, and the public has to understand what I'm talking about. It's very hard for us to do that, because we oftentimes work on our work for so long, and we're not great communicators. You know, and so I remember when I was doing my graduate studies, every time I went to give a presentation, my supervisor told me, now say it as if you're talking to your grandmother. Say the exact same thing, but pretend you're telling it to your grandmother. And so I had to formulate all that in my mind and then translate that in order for me to communicate. So I think as scientists, first of all, we need to be able to develop those skills. Just how do we communicate our work? I mean, we do amazing work. We work on innovations, on technology. We do all this great science. But if we can't be able to communicate it to the general public, if we can't be able to have conversations with government officials who do not have science background, and I believe most of them don't, then that's where there's a disconnect. So in order for us to be bold in our activism, we first of all need to be committed. We need to be committed to our cause and to be aware of what's going on and just go out there as much as we can, engage in CapSci activities, go to the bar, sit with a couple of people who are not scientists and just develop those skills of communication. And just engage. We might find that there's sometimes that we have ways in which we can talk to each other, sometimes not. But then the more we do it, and if we have a commitment towards a specific cause, then I think it's going to be better. But as scientists, we just need to break, because it is scary. I remember the first time I had to give a presentation to a non-science audience, I was like, so I couldn't talk about my nanoparticles and how I synthesize them and whatnot. And so over the past few years, I've been working more on public health issues, and that way allows me to focus my research more on issues that are directly impactful to the public. And so that allows me to be able to directly go to a community and talk to them and say, hey, what's in your water? Can we look at it? And so it's just a process that has to be worked on. Yeah.
So in the back, Emily and I were actually talking about how terrible most scientists actually are talking with the public. And it's true. I think most of us up here are probably guilty of it at some point in time. And so I want to jump on that, going off what you said, how important it is to be able to communicate with the general public, and what's at stake if we don't.
Well, I'd like to say, sort of following up on what Abby was saying about, where we're waiting for more science. I think that it's important for scientists to be talking about what the direction of their research is leading us towards, right? So in our work, we talk about the precautionary principle, or acting where we start seeing the direction. I mean, obviously, there are memes out there of, well, what if we, clean up the water and we, stop climate change and it was all for nothing? And it's, the idea that, trying to move things in a place where the world is a healthier place, it really does require even just saying we don't have enough information, but the information we have tells us we need to be cautious, right? So that we push back on the notion of waiting for final science, right? I think that's one of those things that's in the popular mythology, that there's like, you can answer a question, right? But that's not the way science works, right? We're always asking the next question. And so I think it's important to be engaged in the dialogue, because otherwise the people who are representing science nominally, they're putting on their science hats, are the people who are actually working for the industries. And that's very dangerous. I think it's really important that we have scientists who are independent actually stepping out, and even if they're saying we don't have all the answers, being willing to say what we do know, I think is very important. And I think the public needs this, right? We need to have information to be able to make decisions. And if the only information we're getting that appears to be credible is coming from people who have a deep financial bias, I totally respect the concern about being perceived as being biased if you take a position based on the evidence that you observe. But the people who are out there that are talking about science right now have deep financial ties and are deeply compromised. And we need other voices out there to be able to point to. It's really important.
I think if we don't, as scientists, if we don't effectively communicate, then we'll continue having a disconnect. We'll continue having scientists in the lab working on their own innovations and not having that translate into actual actionable items. I mean, think about the weather. Every time you watch the news, there's a weather forecast, right? Some scientist somewhere is working on data that's going to inform the public that, hey, there's going to be a snowstorm, or there's going to be this type of weather forecast, and then we as a community, we have to reorganize ourselves. The public has to take measures not to, go on the road at specific times, or the county has to put salt on the roads, or there has to be collaboration amongst different sectors. Now, if scientists are working on all these technological advances and we have all this cool data that is supposed to inform some type of work, whether it's through the engineer or through the government, then we're not going to have that effective collaboration. And if we don't have that effective collaboration, then we're not going to be able to mitigate any type of risk, whether it's a climate change risk or a public health risk or any type of risk. We need to be able to work together, because science in the lab does not help anybody. Science needs to move from the lab to people who can actually influence that change and make science become useful for the public.
I'm going to step out of my moderator shoes and into my scientist shoes to add into this. I think making that connection to the basic bench lab work, to how it does eventually down the line impact our lives on a very real every single day basis, is incredibly important. I know my work, and I'm sure other work here, is federally funded, which means it's taxpayer dollars that's funding our research. And it helps to actually explain to these taxpayers what their money is going towards and what it's doing. And if we inform them about the importance and the applicability of our work, they're going to be more likely to vote for representatives that support science and support science funding. And so I think there's this trajectory that really does start at the basic level of making sure we are effective communicators, not only to better the world, but to keep the science going. Because if we don't have people in office who support it, our work stops. All right, I think we're gonna have a couple more questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Sound good? All right, this kind of goes along the same line, but a little bit different. So we currently have a number of measles outbreaks throughout the United States, and even some here in New York as well. And that kind of sets up, what strategies do you suggest for addressing groups who promote pseudoscience without using shame and without using contempt, since that's gonna shut the conversation down right away? Any advice? Go ahead.
Yeah, okay, I'll jump in. Yeah, so we do get a number of calls about these sorts of issues in our office, particularly with the measles vaccine and all the outbreaks and everything going on, about the health risks to vaccination and those sorts of things. And so our office feels that it's our responsibility to make sure that we're educating the public and that we're using the science. We sent out a letter on the importance of vaccines. There was a House resolution, I believe 179, on the importance of vaccines. So we choose to address that way. And then also making sure that we're trying to find some common ground with people, because as you said before, if we meet them with contempt or we meet them with degrading them, it's going to completely shut down the conversation. So we need to find some sort of common ground and see, why are they thinking this way? Is it because of fear? Is it because they're not educated? And try to find these ways to communicate with people. Also, we have in-group buy-in with people. There are people, our neighbors, our friends, that aren't going to think the same way as us. And because we have this in-group buy-in with them, we can speak to them in a way that is probably more effective than if some random person on the internet was speaking to them. So recognize these ways that we can connect with people, I think would be an effective means to this.
Well, I mean, as a sociologist, I just find these kinds of groups really fascinating, and I think that one approach is actually just to try to learn more about them. So we talk about science communication often as sort of a one-way communication, but I mean, partly just out of curiosity, I really think opening a two-way communication and trying to understand a little bit more about the basis for those kinds of beliefs. So, usually, those kinds of ideas are rooted in a larger mistrust of the institutions where like more mainstream ideas come from. So, what are the larger sets of social relations that these people are embedded in, and what are their social networks like that sort of converge around these sets of ideas? I think maybe I'm just exploring this as a sociologist, but I think that we can all sort of explore people's beliefs in those ways, try to figure out where they come from. But one thing that I kind of I have an impression that folks who are like the flat earthers and anti-vaxxers have, that they actually operate a lot like citizen scientists, right? They're actually information seekers. They're really curious about, they see themselves as exploring knowledge through alternative networks. They're just getting it through networks that don't have a lot of really good knowledge. And so I think that's actually potentially an asset and an entry point. So I can sort of imagine a good way of engaging would be to organize citizen science projects that expose people to more diverse sets of knowledge, right? Widen their social networks, bring in alternative forms of expertise for them, right? Expose them to different kinds of of ways of looking at these questions. Because, I mean, from what I was just hearing about flat earther conferences, right? They do research, right? It's fascinating. So let's use that, right? I mean, on the other hand, these are pretty niche groups, so I'm not sure how much impact they're having in the world. But anyway, I think these are ways that we can think about addressing those kinds of groups.
So to go on that, saying how much impact it has on the world, there's a recent survey that is now saying people trust science and scientists less, and it's becoming a bigger and bigger trend. So there is an impact. And it might be you've answered already, but how can we combat this trend or turn it around so we can increase the trust in science and in scientists?
Can I speak to that data, actually? Yeah. So there's actually really good sociological research on this survey data. And so I was looking at some research in preparation for this panel. So there's a study looking at survey data since 1974, trying to figure out the patterns in trust in science. And actually, trust in science among Americans has not declined except among conservatives and those who frequently attend church. So this is what's interesting. So if you take all Americans together, it does look like trust in science has declined, but it's really only among a specific demographic. Among liberals and moderates, trust in science hasn't changed. But there is a problem with this survey data because it only asks really generally about people's confidence in science. So what does that mean, right? Science actually means lots of different things to different people. So this is a survey instrument problem, right? Science, people actually might imagine different things when they're asked that, and confidence can also mean different things. So there have been some other studies trying to kind of hone in on this a little bit more to try to understand, well, what's really going on with conservatives and their trust in science. And there was one that I was just looking at that was really interesting that showed that actually conservatives do have high trust in science that supports innovations for economic production. So there's a distinction in different kinds of science. So conservatives like and trust science that's for innovation. They just don't trust scientists that identify environmental and public health impacts of environmental production. So that shift, so that would suggest that shift since the 1970s has a lot to do with the emergence of environmental sciences since the 1970s and environmental regulations since the 1970s, and conservatives reacting against the growth of the environmental regulatory state and public health regulations, and the way that science is actually being used to rein in some of the activities of, industry and capitalism. And so trust in science is declining among a particular group that actually is just reacting against the particular uses of science. That's what some of the research is suggesting. So I think that's actually super interesting and also gives me hope that it's not just this overall nobody trusts science. It actually is a really specific social group and specific reason for that change. So I think we can look at it a little differently.
They have really good voter turnout, though.
Yes, they do. Yes, they do.
Anyone else want to add on to that before we open things up to the audience? No? No? All right, so we have a microphone standing right here, and we'd be happy to take any questions that you might have for our panelists.
Hi, my name is Eli Sands. I'm a member of CapSci, and thank you all so much for being on this panel. And I'd also like to thank the Sanctuary personally for hosting us. It's a really fantastic event already. My question is about, so the March for Science recently said that May 4th is going to be a day of science activism. And having produced with my fellow CapSci members the past two March for Sciences, I can say that that time frame to produce another march is very difficult. So, so what my question to the panelists is, what can an individual or a small group do on May 4th that you think will be a productive activity in terms of science activism advocacy that requires little to no preparation?
Looking at my calendar, what What day of the week is that? It's a Saturday? Oh, then my answer is not so useful. Because I think it would be really great to have scientists come down and try to meet with legislators in New York State. We're here in the Capitol. You can have an impact on New York State politics even if you're not going down to Washington, D.C. So I think there could be interesting opportunities to consider for the future, not for May 4th, but about ways that you could not just practice your communication with the general public, but communicating with legislators and their staff.
I don't know, but I think one of the things we can do is really just look at our children, like in schools. Go get a group of students and have them write up posters and what is their view of the current state of science. You talked about climate change as being one of the threats, is recorded as one of the threats alongside shooting in schools. So if we can get a voice from our students, why do they think that? And maybe they could just draw something. And I think sometimes you get really valuable information from that. I mean, once I worked with students from the Troy Boys and Girls Club on going green and how to conserve the environment, and they made like poster boards of, dying earth or, no trees, like deforestation or things like that. And those were really powerful voices because they were from children who have no idea about the politics, who have no idea about the science. They just know what's going on with their environment now. And so that could be something that could be done within a day or two. Yeah.
What if everybody held a picnic or backyard barbecue that day and did like a postcard writing to your legislators at the picnic? Like talk about a science issue that matters to you, an environmental issue that matters to you, and have everybody write postcards or letters?
I would say just have a conversation with somebody. We all have a relative or a coworker or somebody who we know that doesn't necessarily believe or trust science, and listen to that person and figure out kind of what their motivation is and why that bias exists, and have a dialogue that isn't argumentative in any way. Actually talk and listen and have a conversation. Anyone else? Right. Sam.
Hello, I'm Sam Wexler. I'm an engineer. My wife, Jessica, back there helped organize this meeting. What was my question now? Cara and Katy and Meghan were kind of talking about politics earlier. Meghan mentioned, the politicians getting their pockets lined with, money. And Cara asked, how effective constituents are at, lobbying. So my question is, say you want to get things done. You want to get a bill passed, say it's a science-based bill. This is mostly for Katy. What's the best way to do that? Would it be to form a grassroots group? Would it be to hire a lobbyist? For example, lately I've heard about the bottle bill. There's been new talks about that. Maybe they want to up it from 5 cents to 10 cents in New York State. And of course, big companies like Pepsi, Coca-Cola, they're going to try to fight that because they don't want to pay the extra money. So what's the best way to get something like that passed, in your opinion, Katy?
So I'm not a policy person, so I can connect with you offline about who might be better served in our office to ask that question to. But I think mobilizing in any way, whether it be letters to the editor, reaching out to your legislators, talking to friends and neighbors, creating a coalition of your own to address whatever issue it is, specifically if it's a bottle bill or anything that you have going on.
I have some thoughts on that. So depends on the issue. If it's one, it's a good idea to first start and look and see if there's an organization, a public interest group like Clean and Healthy New York or the New York Public Interest Research Group or whomever that's already engaged on it, because oftentimes you can tap into the resources that they already have. If you can identify one of those nonprofits that would work on that issue, contacting them to get some insight. If there isn't, going and meeting with your legislator and asking them to introduce a bill on the issue that you want. Legislators do that. So I think gathering together some folks and gathering your information and preparing, but going in and meeting directly with your legislator can be a really important way to get started. But there are a lot of nonprofit organizations in the Capital Region that are working on a lot of public interest issues, and it's possible that there may be one that's already doing the work that you're interested in, and they're often organizing events, they're often organizing days to come and speak to your legislators directly, et cetera, and so there are ways to make it easier to be active that don't require you to build a whole new structure yourself. But if in the absence of that, if you've got something you want to advance, I think it's important to get in there and actually start talking directly with your legislator about what it is and why you think it's really valuable. And then if you've got friends across the state or the country, depending on where you are, who, depending on what level you want to solve the problem at, you would also want to get them to go in and talk with their legislators, right? So you start talking with more people. But I'd be happy to talk with you more about how to get a bill to become a law. That's something that Clean and Healthy New York does as often as possible.
Sure. Yeah, but like how would the congressman make that decision? He's say it's the bottle bill, right? So how would he make the decision to like either support a bunch of science-based stuff that says like, okay, we're going to recycle a lot more bottles, they're not going to be in the landfill, versus Coca-Cola's going to they're going to lose a bunch of money and maybe jobs. So like, how would somebody, I'm just curious about it. I don't know. That's
Yeah,
all.
so we have specific policy people. Ours are based in DC, and each of them have different issue areas in which they're an expert. So we have someone in our office that is a particular expert on energy and clean technology and environment and defense. And then we have other people that are better suited for immigration issues, LGBTQ issues. So it would be a lot of talks with them who are already probably aware of this issue, but then bringing it to them and bringing that unique perspective of someone being affected by it as well is also incredibly important.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm John. I'm not a scientist.
Nobody's perfect. It's okay.
Thank you. So anyway, it's a perspective, though. You guys are all on the same page, and it's not like I'm not on that page with you, okay? But I hope you understand what you're fighting about or what you're fighting against. What this country drives this country is two things: greed and fear. Okay? And unless good science is able to take on greed or fear, you have no shot. Okay? And the problem with fear, we talk about the fact that, hey, if we don't do these things, coastal flooding, glaciers, climate change, okay, the inability to breathe, the inability to have fresh water, that doesn't do anything, because by the time there's a crisis where people actually fear, it's too late. Okay? It's too late. The way things get done in this country is through mass protests. Whether it's civil rights, whether it's a war in Vietnam, we don't have time to have civil protests for climate change. So what's the other option? The other option is greed. You have to start saying, if we have good science, we have a good economy. We're not taking jobs away from people. We're making them jobs. We're giving them jobs, jobs that they otherwise wouldn't have, like the flyover states. They have nothing, okay? Once those jobs have left those flyover states, they have nothing. So to the degree that good science can replace or provide jobs for those type of individuals, you got a shot. And there are examples, windmills, solar. What we have shown is we've shown that they can provide jobs for people that otherwise wouldn't have jobs. I live in Florida half the year. I go down to Florida. You'd be amazed how many solar panels they are not, okay? And unless...
So, sir, do you have a question?
So the question is, how can we do that?
Okay, thank you.
Well, given the fact that, mass movements were referenced within that question, it's tricky because thinking about everything that you were just saying, Katy, and Bobbi, you were saying, and not wanting to negate the work and my own work of working through systems to bring messaging that's going to bring about change, I mean, I think there does have to be a reckoning that it's late in the game, and that the communities around the world that are the most vulnerable are already being the most impacted, and that a mass movement is needed, and that potentially interruptions to the systems are needed. Maybe it's all needed. Maybe the postcard writing and the meet with your legislator and stand up at the Albany County legislature and say, you know, we need a plastic bag ban and all of those things, that's needed. But I also think that my own personal draw to Extinction Rebellion is that it's like stop the denial here. Like, if we are gonna take the IPCC report seriously, and some people, from what I've read, even think that that was kind of moderate in terms of the crisis level, then there does need to be a mass movement and also interruptions to the system. People willing to put their lives on the line to, you know, bring this messaging, because there doesn't seem to be a major movement right now. You know, I mean, I think that that's the beauty of Greta Thunberg's argument, is that you have to have, you know, you can throw around these words politically like hope, or you can think about hope, but in order to really have hope, you have to see that things are actually changing, and they're not changing fast enough. So there's kind of this paradox where it's like, if you do look at the science, we have very little time to make these huge changes. I know in Albany County, they're trying to, their proposals to get to renewables by 2040, but even 2040 is really, really late. It's really late. Mert Simpson of the legislator from Albany, the other day, I mean, he gave this amazing talk at the Climate Change and Urban Communities Caucus that happened at the Albany Library, and he kept saying, like, it's late in the game, and you're not dealing with politicians that are acting like it's a crisis. So I just feel like that whole idea of civil disobedience, interruption, the hard thing is that we're not living within a mass culture that is really promoting that as well. But I think that people have to start, and what happened in England is that people, there were these small meetings, and then to shut down the 5 major bridges into London, something caught on. It's like, you know, something caught fire. And I think that right now, Extinction Rebellion in the United States is forming in major cities, because the idea is that if you go down to New York, the message will get across. Like Rolling Stone covered what happened in January, and a few other big news outlets covered what happened. So the idea is, okay, start in New York, and then the messaging will take off. But I also think we're lucky in the capital region that we do live in an area where, you know, there is this policy being made, and that maybe we need to start with, interrupting systems in any way. I know that people have interrupted, like in England, there's been interruptions of, parliamentary meetings and things like that. But I just think that we're at that level of a crisis point.
Can I just say that when it comes to climate change, none of these conversations would be happening if it weren't for diligent scientists. I just think it's, you said it even as you were talking about it, the science shows us that we have very little time, right? This is not something that, particularly this issue, that we have to take the evidence we have, but it's because there's evidence being gathered by scientists that we understand what the global impact is to begin with, right? So I think that it's really important that as we're plotting which strategies we use to be most effective, and I'm a firm believer in both inside and outside strategies, because that's how you can make the most effective change. So if you've actually got pressure being applied from the outside, particularly with people who otherwise feel the weight of the coins in their pockets, or who are resisting putting coins in their pockets but have to trade and have conversations with their fellow legislators who are getting a lot of campaign contributions. Pressure definitely makes a difference, but it would not be happening if we did not have science, right? This is an issue that we only can understand because we actually are looking at the evidence being gathered by science. So I think it's important, as we're saying which action to take, that we're also contemplating the impact of how we make sure that people who care are empowered with the best information so that we can sound the alarms, right? I think that's key.
Fun fact, the scientist who discovered that carbon dioxide leads to global warming, her name's Eunice Newton Foote, and she went to Emma Willard, and she discovered that in the mid-19th century, but did not receive credit for it. My friend found that out the other day.
I'm going to break this up a little bit. I'm not a scientist. I'm an artist. Even worse, maybe. But I've been thinking, when I was a child, one of the great disappointments that I had was that I didn't really have the math to move into the sciences. So I became an artist who looks at science romantically and critically, and who gets to work with scientists. And I would say that, this panel sort of refutes some of your earlier claims that scientists aren't any good at communicating things. I think this has been a really engaging panel. And it makes me think a little bit about the importance of things like symbols. I guess many people would look to the oil spill off Santa Barbara in 1970 and the unscheduled Earthrise photograph from Apollo 8 as a kind of catalyst for the environmental movement. And so I recently was on a panel a couple of weeks ago at Purdue with Amy Ross, who's NASA's chief spacesuit designer. She got a little bit of ribbing for NASA not having enough, female-size spacesuits for the spacewalk. But what was really engaging was the artists and the scientists on this panel sort of talked about what set them off on their journey. And I was wondering if you could each briefly maybe say what the catalyst for your activism or becoming a scientist or becoming a scholar around the sciences was. Thanks.
I'll start. I have a story. It's because it's easy because it's a really specific story. My dad's a physicist, so I grew up doing lots of scientific work. I had my own lab notebook and, tested different markers to see, which ones extracted which colors, et cetera. But there was, I lived in Southeast Michigan, and there was a sort of wooded area behind my house that hadn't been developed, and a tree line had missed being cut down in all of the clearing that had happened. So there were some gigantic trees that I couldn't put my arms around even as an adult. And the property was sold and it was purchased, and a family was building sort of one unit, but it was multiple individual spaces. And I discovered that by a loophole in the law, they were allowed to cut down these basically old growth trees that just totally broke my heart. And that if they had been building separate units or if it had been for separate families, they wouldn't have been allowed to do that. So it was my own environmental destruction, right? My own childhood play area where trees that I loved were taken down. And so it became very personal. My mom was a block coordinator for the recycling program in Ann Arbor that was run by a nonprofit. So I used to hang the tags on all the doors to tell people how to recycle. But the thing that really catalyzed me and moved me at 12 from someone who just did that stuff because my parents made me to really thinking about how I was going to make a difference myself was the loss of those trees and the recognition that it was decisions human beings made about the environment that was affecting that.
So personally, I'm from Kenya. Kenya is in East Africa. When you talk about fear, when you think about climate change impacts, things like drought, food insecurity, lack of clean water, water contamination, those are things that are already happening in other areas around the world. We're very lucky because in the US, we haven't started seeing the impacts as yet. But I grew up in a community where I was looking and really living in that type of environment. And so it caused me to ask, what can I do as a scientist? Well, just as a person, I just got into science because I was good in math. As I was good in math, then I went into chemistry because chemistry was easier than history. History was easier than sociology, sorry. But then one thing led to another, and as I got an opportunity to come and study in the United States, at that point, I never really knew what I wanted to do with my science. I just knew, oh, I got a scholarship. Yay, I'm going to the US. Wonderful. But as I started getting into my research, I started asking myself, what can I do to bring solution to some of these problems? And so a lot of the work that I do have been tying back to where I'm coming from, food insecurity, water sanitation, and trying to use what I've been trained in, what I've been knowledgeable in to impact the communities back in Africa.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. So, sir, you're the winner. And perhaps if the panelists are willing to stick around, if you folks want to answer questions individually later on, we can.
I'd like to thank you for all your work. I appreciate it. I'm the son of an engineer. I'm a recovering psychology major. I have a question in that realm. Do you have scientists in psychology that are working with these groups to develop strategic talking points to kind of counter the corporate brainwashing that there's a lot of money and a lot of things? I mean, there's certain things like my brothers, they'll go for protection, but they don't go for regulation because regulation has been branded evil, or poison versus climate change. And so do you have scientists working with you, psychology scientists, on messaging and on actions? And I would point to Greta as an example of that straight talk that gets through to everybody.
So we don't have any people that are specifically psychologists in our office. We have a communications team that certainly does good work on things that you've mentioned, but I agree. I think messaging is very important, especially with things like this. I mean, when you say things are a death tax, suddenly people don't want it anymore. And the DARK Act, suddenly people are against the GMOs in food. So I totally understand that perspective, and I think that messaging is an incredibly important part of getting across policy and getting things done.
All right, so I think to wrap up, for everybody, I'm sorry, we're wrapping up right now. Stick around and the panelists will be happy to talk. They can't hear you.
I just haven't heard 5 or 10 minutes. I'm sure you can hold
5
it.
to 10 minutes is not okay.
Could we take a vote upon this? Because there was somebody from this organization that came to my home since last night and has been doing an interview with me and told me she didn't know how she was going to be able to get it out there for what I've been trying to express to the news channels, the Times Union paper. I was supposed to meet with the Times Union paper today. She didn't show up. I spent the day in Manans waiting for this woman. She didn't even text me. This girl that's standing back there hiding in the corner right now is the one that came to
Excuse me, ma'am, this is not a forum for that. If you have a question for our panelists, please ask. Otherwise, okay, please ask your question.
Okay, so it says the state of science is what we're here for. So health is a part of science, is it not? Is it not the part of science? I want to start, this is going to take 5-10 minutes if you guys won't mind. Okay.
Yeah, that's not okay. You have to ask a question of the panel. Ma'am, I am sorry. If you have a question for our panelists, you can ask it here, but if it's something else that's not part of this, then please ask.
Okay, I'm asking the panel that I'm trying to tell you that my daughter was just released out of a hospital because of lead poisoning. These homes in Troy all have lead asbestos because they were built past 1979. And any home past 1979 not only contains lead, it also contains asbestos. So any of your children that are under the age of 12 are affected by this. So if you are a resident of Troy, New York, your children could be affected. And as an adult, it also has effects on you.
So your question, ma'am.
My question is, I would think what I'm trying to say is a very important part of science. and I would think there would be no reason why you wouldn't want to hear what I have to say.
So I appreciate this. Everybody should take this and heed the warning that, according to this house, if you would like to talk to this woman after the fact
It's not
about the poison.
house, ma'am. I have no place to live. My daughter spent
Okay, then ma'am,
days in the hospital.
ma'am, I'm sorry, but this is not the forum for that. If anyone would like to discuss this issue with her after the fact, please see her in the back of the room. So to end this panel discussion in 30 seconds or less for each of you, not all together, for each of you, what is one key point you hope everyone leaves here with?
I'll go first. Okay, so stay mobilized, make sure that we're focusing on our communication, telling our human stories as a part of science as well, relating it to our neighbors, have those conversations, and also make sure that you're getting out to vote as well, because it's incredibly important to let your legislators know, and you can do that right at the ballot box.
Oh, thank you very much for coming. It's great that you spent your time to come here, and I just want to encourage you to keep going to as many of these events as possible, keep voicing, keep that conversation going so that we can all see towards a better change for everybody.
I'd like to thank everyone for coming as well, and just to really hammer home the fact that we all have a voice. I am not a scientist on this panel. I am an English teacher and an activist, but that all people should have a voice within the articulation of environmental and climate issues.
I also would really like to thank CapSci for a really interesting and productive conversation. I think that it's important for people to stay engaged. It can be painful to start being frustrated by uncertainty, and whatever it is that you heard here that inspired you in any way, whether it was thinking about writing letters or thinking about disruption, anywhere in between, do those things, be engaged. That's the one thing that I hope folks will take from this.
Yeah, I likewise, thank you for this. This was really amazing. Yeah, we all have a stake in science, and I think we can all be part of it in an active way, in lots of different ways, whatever our profession, whatever form of activism we engage in. I think we heard many different ways that science intersects in our everyday lives, and the stakes are really high, and we need to be a part of it. So, yeah.
All right, I'd like to thank our amazing panel of all women, by the way.
Yeah.
So let's give them a round of applause. And thank you also to the Sanctuary for Independent Media and CapSci for an amazing production this afternoon. Thank you all so much for the effort you put in to make this happen. Have a wonderful afternoon, everybody.